Paris Jackson was only 11 years old when the world changed in a way no child should have to experience. One day, she was Michael Jackson's daughter, living inside one of the strangest childhoods imaginable. The next, her father was dead, the cameras were everywhere, and the private world he had spent years building around his children was suddenly gone. And now, years later, Paris is talking about that period with a level of honesty that makes her story much more complicated than the image people had of the king of pop's only daughter. Because before the addiction, the headlines, the tattoos, music career, and red carpets, there was Neverland. And the Neverland story people imagined wasn't the childhood Paris experienced. In a recent interview, Paris explained that she and her brothers, Prince and Bigi, only lived at Neverland for a relatively short period. And despite the amusement park, zoo, and fantasy-like surroundings, the children weren't simply allowed to run around and enjoy everything whenever they wanted. Her father had rules. The attractions were primarily intended for underprivileged and terminally ill children. Paris said she and her brothers could use them as rewards after completing schoolwork and chores. Even television wasn't something they could simply watch all day. Michael wanted structure. The children were also hidden from the public. When they went outside, they often wore masks so they could move through the world without immediately being recognized. For Paris, that created an unusual childhood. She was being raised by one of the most famous people on earth, yet she didn't fully understand just how famous her father was. She had spent much of her early life being homeschooled, surrounded largely by family and adults. Then Michael died on June 25, 2009. Suddenly, the girl behind the mask had to face the world without the person who had protected her from it. At his memorial service in July 2009, 11-year-old Paris walked onto the stage and spoke publicly about her father. She has since explained that the decision happened spontaneously. She didn't plan some carefully prepared speech. She simply felt compelled to speak when no other family member stepped forward. Millions watched, but Paris has said she has never watched that footage back. That tells you something about how strange that moment was. She wasn't an adult celebrity giving a tribute. She was a child who had just lost her father. And then came adolescence. This is where the story becomes much darker. Paris has described the years after Michael's death as an extremely difficult transition. She had to learn social skills almost from scratch, suddenly attend school, and deal with a level of attention that most teenagers could never comprehend. She was grieving. She was being photographed. She was being discussed online, and she was trying to figure out who she was without the person who had been the center of her world. By her early teens, things became increasingly dangerous. Paris has spoken openly about depression, self-harm, suicidal behavior, substance abuse. She was sent to a therapeutic school in Utah. At the time, it was presented as a place where she could get help. Years later, however, Paris described the experience as traumatic and said she developed PTSD and continued to have nightmares and trust issues connected to her time there. So the person the public saw emerging from Michael Jackson's shadow wasn't simply a rebellious celebrity teenager. She was a young woman dealing with grief, trauma, addiction, and a tremendous amount of public scrutiny. And there was another problem. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about who Paris Jackson was supposed to be. Michael Jackson's daughter, the girl from Neverland, the mysterious child behind the mask, the controversial teenager. People wanted her to explain her father. They wanted to know what she remembered. They wanted to know what happened inside the Jackson family. They wanted to know whether she would become a singer. And eventually, Paris realized that she didn't know the public every part of her life. That realization became important to her recovery. Paris has now been sober since January 2020. She has openly identified herself as being in recovery from alcohol and heroin addiction, and in January 2026, she marked 6 years sober. But she has made an important point. Getting sober didn't magically make everything easy. In fact, she has said some of the hardest periods came after she stopped using substances. That's a crucial part of her story because recovery is often portrayed as a clean ending. Paris describes something much more realistic. When drugs and alcohol were gone, she still had to learn how to live with herself. She had to develop healthier ways to cope. She had to sit with grief instead of escaping it. And she had to figure out what actually made her happy. Music became one of those things. Paris had played guitar since she was a teenager, but she was initially afraid to take music seriously because of her father's enormous legacy. Imagine being Michael Jackson's daughter and deciding you want to become a musician. The comparison is unavoidable. Every note would be analyzed. Every performance would invite questions about her father. Every mistake could become a headline. But eventually, Paris stopped treating music as something she needed to prove and started treating it as something that made her feel alive. In 2026, she described music as something that helped carry her through the hardest period of her life. She said it was essentially what got her through the difficult years before sobriety. That is a very different relationship with her father's legacy. She isn't trying to become Michael. She is trying to become Paris. And that distinction seems to matter more to her now than ever. Her relationship with Michael has also changed publicly. For years, Paris felt pressure to talk about him, especially around birthdays, anniversaries, and major moments connected to his legacy. But recently she explained that she no longer believes she owes the public a performance of her grief. Her relationship with her father, she says, is personal, and that might be one of the clearest signs that she has grown. When she was a child, other people controlled the narrative. After Michael died, the media helped define what Paris Jackson was. During her teenage years, headlines defined her struggles. Now, she is choosing what parts of herself belong to the public. That includes her relationship with her mother, Debbie Rowe. Paris did not grow up with Rowe as her primary parent. Michael had custody, and Paris has explained that she didn't meet her mother in person until she was around 15. That reunion became another unusual chapter in a childhood already filled with unusual circumstances. Yet Paris doesn't seem interested in turning every family detail into a public spectacle. Instead, she appears increasingly focused on building her own life. She has worked as a singer, actress, and model. She has released music, performed live, and developed an alternative rock identity that is far removed from the polished pop image associated with her father. She has also become more comfortable talking about recovery without presenting herself as someone who has everything figured out. And perhaps that's the biggest change. The girl who once needed to hide behind a mask is now standing in front of cameras by choice. But she's also learned when to walk away from them. That's important because Paris has spent her entire life being watched. At 11, the world watched her mourn. At 15, the world watched her struggle. In her late teens and 20s, the world watched her tattoos, relationships, career choices, and appearance. Now, at 28, she seems far more interested in controlling what the world gets to see. She has described herself as being in a strong period of her life, while continuing to acknowledge that recovery has difficult seasons, and that may be the most honest ending to her story. There isn't one. Paris Jackson didn't leave Neverland and suddenly become healed. Michael's death didn't create one problem that disappeared with time. Her adolescence wasn't simply rebellion. Her addiction wasn't simply celebrity excess. And sobriety wasn't a magical reset button. It has been a long process of learning how to live after losing the person who made her childhood feel safe, while also learning who she is outside his huge shadow. Today, she can talk about Michael without allowing the public to own their relationship. She can make music without trying to sound like him. She can remember Neverland without letting strangers tell her what her childhood was supposed to have been. And she can talk about addiction without allowing it to become her entire identity. That is probably the real story of Paris Jackson. Not the headlines. Not even the famous surname.